Queen Zarathil stood before the massive crystal window of her palace, watching the orange sky burn above her world. The humans had come again, their ships dark against the sunset like metal vultures waiting to feed. She pressed her golden hand against the cool surface, feeling the vibrations from distant explosions that shook even her mighty fortress. Her advisors had taught her well over the years. Humans were destroyers who consumed everything in their path. They cared nothing for beauty or honor or the sacred bonds between families. They were machines made of flesh that knew only hunger and violence. Every story she had heard since childhood proved this truth. The war had stolen 30 years of her life. 30 years of watching her people die while these monsters spread across Valkyrie space like a plague. Her parents had died in the first attack when she was barely old enough to understand what death meant. The crown had fallen to her young shoulders along with the weight of an entire species seeking revenge. She turned from the window as heavy footsteps echoed in the throne room. Commander Veltar approached with his usual grim expression, his silver armor bearing fresh scorch marks from the latest battle. His reptilian features showed the exhaustion they all felt after decades of endless fighting. "My queen, the humans have broken through our outer defenses," he reported, his voice carrying the weight of another defeat. "They advance on the civilian sectors with their usual disregard for innocent lives." Zarathil's golden eyes flashed with familiar anger. The humans always targeted the helpless first. It was their way to break the spirit of those who dared resist their expansion. Her advisors had warned her this day would come when the monsters finally reached their homeworld. "How long do we have?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would not be good. "Perhaps 2 days if our remaining forces can hold the mountain passes," Veltar replied. "The evacuation ships are loading civilians as quickly as possible, but there are so many who refuse to leave their homes." She understood their reluctance. This world had been Valkyrie home for countless generations. The crystal cities reflected their history in every facet. The sacred groves held the spirits of their ancestors. To abandon it all felt like betraying everything they were. A small voice interrupted her dark thoughts. "Mother, are the bad humans coming here?" Prince Kelwyn stood in the doorway, his young silver scales catching the light from the crystal walls. At only 7 cycles old, he had known nothing but war stories and evacuation drills. His innocent question cut through her heart like a blade. "Come here, my little star," she said gently, kneeling to embrace her son. His small body trembled against her, not from cold but from the fear that lived in all their hearts. She stroked his head, feeling the tiny scales that would grow magnificent like her own in time. "Tell me again why the humans are evil," Kelwyn whispered, repeating a ritual they had shared many times. "Because they destroy without reason," Zarathil replied, the words automatic after years of repetition. "They take worlds that do not belong to them. They kill families and feel no sadness. They are empty inside where love should live." The child nodded seriously, absorbing these lessons as he always did. His toy ships lay scattered on the floor nearby, small Valkyrie vessels he had positioned to fight larger human models. Even in play, the war shaped his young mind. Commander Veltar cleared his throat respectfully. "My queen, we have also received reports that human ground forces are moving through the lower districts. They seem to be targeting the evacuation routes specifically." More proof of human cruelty, she thought bitterly. They would not even allow civilians to escape safely. Her advisors had been right about every terrible prediction they had made about these creatures. "Double the guard around the evacuation zones," she commanded, rising to her feet while keeping Kelwyn close. "I will not let them slaughter our people like animals." "My queen, perhaps you should consider leaving with the evacuation ships," Veltar suggested carefully. "Your safety is more important than any symbolic gesture." Zarathil's eyes blazed with determination. "I was crowned to protect my people, not to abandon them when they need me most. If the humans want our world, they will have to take it from my cold hands." The commander bowed deeply, recognizing the fierce pride that had kept their species fighting when others might have surrendered. "Then we will make our final stand worthy of the songs our children will sing." As night fell over the burning world, Zarathil made her preparations. She donned her ceremonial armor, its golden plates inscribed with the names of every Valkyrie world the humans had conquered. Each name was a reminder of why this war mattered, why surrender was impossible. Kelwyn watched solemnly as his mother prepared for battle. "Will you kill many humans tomorrow, Mother?" "As many as I can, little star," she promised, kissing his forehead. "For you, for our people, and for all those who can no longer fight." She had no way of knowing that on the other side of the war, a human soldier named Jake Morrison was also preparing for battle. He checked his equipment with the same care, thought of home with the same longing, and worried about tomorrow with the same fear. Neither could imagine that their paths would soon cross in a way that would change everything they believed about their enemies. Neither could see beyond the hate that had been carefully planted in their hearts over years of loss and propaganda. The Crystal Palace shuddered as another human bombardment struck the city. Zarathil held her son tighter, whispering ancient Valkyrie prayers for strength and victory. Tomorrow would bring the battle that might end their world, but tonight she was simply a mother trying to comfort her frightened child. The war machine ground onward, carrying them all toward a destiny none of them could predict. Jake Morrison crouched behind the twisted remains of what had once been a beautiful alien garden, his rifle ready as explosions lit up the sky above. The Valkyrie city burned around him, its crystal towers cracking under the weight of human orbital bombardment. 3 days of fighting had turned the once magnificent capital into a nightmare of rubble and smoke. His squad had been separated during the chaotic street battles that morning. The aliens fought harder here than anywhere else, defending their homeworld with desperate courage that reminded Jake uncomfortably of stories from his own planet. He pushed those thoughts away, focusing on survival as energy bolts winged past. His head, the young sergeant from Earth's farming colonies, had never wanted this war. His own world had been peaceful until raiders attacked, killing his sister and destroying everything his family had built. The military had seemed like the only way to protect others from suffering the same loss. Now, surrounded by alien homes, reduced to ash, he wondered if he had become the very thing he once fought against. His radio crackled with static and distant voices. "Morrison, report your position. We need all units to advance on the evacuation zones." Jake keyed his microphone while scanning the empty street ahead. "Sergeant Morrison here. Moving through Residential District 7. No contact with enemy forces at this time." The orders made his stomach twist. Intelligence suggested the aliens were concentrating their remaining civilians in specific areas for mass evacuation. Command wanted those zones secured before the enemy could escape. Jake understood the tactical reasoning, but the thought of trapping families trying to flee sat heavy on his conscience. He moved carefully through the ruins, his enhanced combat suit detecting heat signatures and movement in the surrounding buildings. Most seemed empty now, abandoned as their owners fled or died. Occasionally he glimpsed personal belongings scattered among the debris, alien toys, family pictures, things that reminded him these had been homes filled with love and laughter. The residential district showed more damage than the military zones. Orbital strikes had collapsed entire city blocks, burying whatever lay beneath under tons of crystal and metal. Emergency lights flickered weakly in the dust-filled air, casting strange shadows that made every corner potentially dangerous. A new sound caught his attention over the constant rumble of distant artillery. Aircraft engines, but not human ones. The high-pitched whine belonged to Valkyrie fighters, and they were close. Jake pressed himself against a partially collapsed wall as 3 sleek ships roared overhead, heading toward the evacuation zones. His unit was supposed to secure. Minutes later, the sky erupted in fire and thunder. The aerial battle raged directly above him as human interceptors engaged the alien craft. Energy weapons painted brilliant lines across the orange sky while missiles traced smoking arcs between the combatants. Jake watched one of the Valkyrie ships spin out of control, trailing flames as it fell toward the city below. The crash was spectacular and terrible. The alien fighter slammed into a cluster of buildings several blocks away, the explosion rattling windows that had somehow survived the earlier bombardments. Secondary explosions followed as the ship's fuel ignited, sending pillars of fire high into the air. Jake's training told him to report the crash and continue his mission. Enemy personnel might have survived and could pose a threat to advancing human forces, but as he moved toward the crash site, he began hearing sounds that made his blood run cold. Screaming voices, not of soldiers but of civilians caught in the destruction. The crash had occurred near one of the evacuation zones. Families trying to escape had taken shelter in the surrounding buildings when the air battle began. Now those same structures were collapsing as fires spread through their crystal frameworks. Jake could see small figures moving in the smoke. Trying desperately to dig survivors from the rubble, he paused at the edge of the disaster zone, watching alien civilians work frantically to save their own people. These were not the monsters his commanding officers described in briefings. They were parents searching for children, neighbors helping neighbors, ordinary people facing extraordinary horror with courage and compassion. One group caught his attention. Several aliens worked around what appeared to be a collapsed shelter, their movements urgent and coordinated. Even from a distance, Jake could see the desperation in their actions. Someone was trapped beneath the debris, and time was running out. His radio buzzed again with orders to secure the area and call for backup. Standard procedure dictated treating all aliens as potential combatants until proven otherwise. But Jake found himself moving forward instead of calling for reinforcement. Drawn by sounds that needed no translation, a child was crying somewhere under the rubble. The aliens working at the collapse site noticed his approach and froze with terror. Several reached for weapons while others threw themselves protectively over the digging site. Their fear was obvious and understandable, a human soldier appearing in their moment of greatest vulnerability could only mean death, but Jake slowly lowered his rifle and raised his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The aliens watched him with suspicion and desperation, torn between protecting their trapped companion and accepting help from their sworn enemy. One alien stepped forward, and Jake's breath caught in recognition. Even covered in dust and blood? The golden scales and regal bearing were unmistakable. This was Queen Zarathil herself, the legendary leader of Volcari resistance. Intelligence files contained detailed descriptions of her appearance and the massive bounty placed on her capture. She spoke in her own language, words Jake could not understand but whose meaning was clear in their tone. She was asking why he was here, what he intended to do. Her hand rested on a weapon, ready to defend her people even against impossible odds. Jake looked at the desperate rescue efforts, at the crying child trapped somewhere beneath the collapsed building, at the alien queen who stood between him and an easy victory. Every rule of war said he should call for backup and claim his prisoners. Every instinct for survival said he should eliminate the threat and secure the area. Instead, he dropped his pack and began moving toward the rubble pile. The sound of the trapped child grew louder as Jake approached, a sound that transcended species barriers and spoke directly to his heart. Somewhere under tons of debris, a young life hung in the balance while political hatred and military objectives suddenly seemed far less important than simple human decency. Queen Zarathil watched the human soldier with growing confusion as he ignored his weapon and began examining the collapse site with professional expertise. This was not the behavior she had been taught to expect from the heartless destroyers of worlds. Jake knelt beside the rubble pile, running his hands over the broken crystal and twisted metal while his suit's sensors analyzed the structural damage. The collapse was worse than it had appeared from a distance. Tons of debris had fallen in, a complex pattern that created both protection and deadly instability for whoever lay trapped beneath. Queen Zarathil watched him with growing bewilderment. Every story she had heard about humans painted them as ruthless killers who showed no mercy to alien life. Yet this soldier ignored his weapon and focused entirely on the rescue effort. Her advisors had warned her that humans were capable of deception, but what strategic value could this performance possibly have? The support beam is compromised, Jake muttered to himself, studying the readings on his scanner. His translation device automatically converted his words to Volcari, allowing the aliens around him to understand his assessment. One wrong move and the whole section comes down. The child's cries grew weaker beneath the debris, a sound that made Jake's chest tighten with familiar pain. He had heard similar sounds on his homeworld when raiders attacked his family settlement. The memory of his young sister calling for help drove him forward. Despite the obvious dangers, he began moving smaller pieces of debris, testing each movement carefully to avoid triggering a larger collapse. His enhanced human strength allowed him to lift stones that the slighter Valkyrie could not handle alone, but even his augmented muscles had limits against the massive weight pressing down. Zarathil found herself stepping closer, torn between suspicion and desperate hope. Her son Kelwyn was trapped somewhere in that maze of broken crystal and metal. Every second that passed reduced his chances of survival, yet accepting help from a human felt like betraying everything she believed. "You need to understand the crystal matrix," she said finally, her voice tight with internal conflict. "Valkyrie architecture follows growth patterns that humans might not recognize." Jake looked up in surprise, meeting her golden eyes for the first time. The hatred he expected to see was still there, but it was mixed with something else. The desperate love of a mother willing to work with her worst enemy to save her child. "Show me," he said simply, making room for her beside the debris pile. Together, they examined the collapse pattern while other Valkyrie civilians emerged from hiding to help. Zarathil explained how the crystal supports grew in spiral patterns that distributed weight differently than human metal construction. Jake shared his knowledge of structural engineering, pointing out stress points and safe excavation routes. The unlikely partnership felt surreal to both of them. Jake found himself working alongside the most wanted alien leader in Valkyrie space, while Zarathil collaborated with a member of the species she had been raised to see as pure evil. Yet their shared focus on saving a trapped child created a bridge across years of hatred and propaganda. Other aliens joined the effort, bringing tools salvaged from nearby ruins. They worked in careful coordination, removing debris piece by piece while monitoring the unstable sections above. Jake's radio continued crackling with orders to report his position, but he ignored the calls completely. "Not without the kid," he told his commanding officer when the demands became too insistent. He had no idea he was referring to alien royalty, only that a child needed help and nothing else mattered at that moment. The rescue work revealed a narrow tunnel through the debris, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Jake's scanner showed it led toward the trapped child, but the passage was extremely unstable. Any shift in the surrounding rubble could close the tunnel permanently, crushing anyone inside. "I can fit through there," Jake said, studying the opening. His combat armor was more flexible than it appeared, designed to allow movement through tight spaces during urban warfare. "Someone needs to go in and get the kid out." Zarathil grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Why?" she demanded, her golden eyes searching his face for some hint of deception. "Why would you risk your life for one of us?" Jake looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. "Because that's what people do," he said quietly. "When a child is in trouble, you help. It doesn't matter what they look like or where they come from." The simple honesty in his voice shattered something inside Zarathil's carefully constructed worldview. Her advisors had taught her that humans were incapable of genuine compassion, that any kindness they showed was merely a tool for manipulation. But there was no strategic advantage to this act, no military value in risking his life for an alien child. Before she could respond, Jake was already crawling into the tunnel. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and he had to remove most of his gear to squeeze through. Every movement sent small cascades of debris falling around him, reminders of how precarious the entire structure had become. Inside the tunnel, darkness closed around him except for the pale glow of his helmet lights. The air was thick with dust and the smell of cooling metal. He could hear the child's voice more clearly now, weak calls in an alien language that his heart understood perfectly. Behind him, Zarathil coordinated with the other civilians to monitor the stability of the debris pile. For the first time in her reign, she worked alongside her subjects as an equal rather than issuing orders from her throne. The shared crisis stripped away the barriers between queen and commoner, revealing their common desire to protect innocent life. Jake reached A small pocket in the debris where Prince Kelwin lay trapped. The young Valkyrie's leg was pinned under a heavy beam, and his silver scales were pale with shock and pain. But his golden eyes were alert and frightened, so much like his mother's that Jake felt an unexpected surge of protective instinct. "Hey? There, little guy," Jake said softly, activating his suit's medical systems. "I'm here to get you out of this mess." Kelwin stared at him with confusion and fear. The child had been taught that humans were monsters, yet this one spoke gently, and began treating his injuries with careful expertise. Jake used his emergency medical supplies to stabilize the young prince while working to free his trapped leg. "I have a nephew about your age back home," Jake continued, trying to keep the child calm while he worked. "His name is Billy, and he's always getting into trouble too. Last month he got stuck in our old well and scared everyone half to death." The sound of Jake's voice, calm and reassuring despite their desperate situation, seemed to ease some of Kelwin's fear. The child could not understand the words, but the tone carried meaning that transcended language barriers. This human was trying to help him, not hurt him, outside the tunnel. Zarathil listened to the muffled conversation through her translation device. Hearing a human soldier comfort her son with stories of his own family created a cognitive dissonance that shook her to her core. Everything she believed about these creatures was crumbling like the debris around them. Jake worked carefully to free Prince Kelwin's trapped leg while the unstable debris groaned ominously around them. The metal beam pinning the young Valkyrie was heavier than it looked, wedged at an angle that made removal extremely dangerous. One wrong move could bring down the entire pocket of space they occupied. "This might hurt a little, buddy," Jake warned as he prepared to lift the beam. His enhanced strength could handle the weight, but he needed to time the movement perfectly to avoid triggering a collapse. Kelwin nodded bravely, though his golden eyes showed the fear any child would feel in such circumstances. The young prince had heard countless stories about human cruelty, yet this soldier spoke to him with the same gentle tone his mother used during bedtime stories. The contradiction confused his young mind but offered unexpected comfort. Jake positioned himself carefully and lifted the beam with controlled force. The debris around them shifted dangerously, sending small stones cascading down from above. But the passage held, and Kelwin's leg came free with a gasp of pain and relief. "There we go," Jake said, quickly examining the injured limb. His medical scanner showed bruising and possible fractures, but nothing that would prevent movement with proper support. "Can you move your toes for me?" The child wiggled his small digits obediently, bringing a smile to Jake's face despite their desperate situation. He activated his suit's emergency medical systems, applying nano-bandages and pain relief compounds while improvising a splint from debris outside the tunnel. Queen Zarathil paced anxiously while coordinating with the other civilians. They had established a human chain to remove debris as quietly as possible, each person passing stones and crystal fragments away from the rescue site. The work proceeded slowly to avoid disturbing the delicate balance keeping the tunnel from collapsing. Her royal guards had arrived during the rescue effort, their weapons trained on the opening where the human soldier had disappeared. "Commander." Veltar stood beside her with obvious confusion, unable to understand why his queen allowed an enemy to risk his life for her son. "My queen, this could be an elaborate trap," he whispered urgently. "The human might be planning to take Prince Kelwin as a hostage." Zarathil considered his words, knowing they represented the logical military response to this situation. Every tactical manual would advise extreme caution when dealing with enemy personnel, especially in such vulnerable circumstances. Yet she found herself defending the human's actions even to her own advisors. "If he wanted to harm my son, he would have done so already," she replied quietly. "There are easier ways to take prisoners than crawling through unstable rubble." The sounds of movement in the tunnel grew louder as Jake began the dangerous journey back toward the opening. He carried Prince Kelwin against his chest, one arm supporting the injured child, while the other felt along the tunnel walls for guidance. Each movement had to be precise and careful to avoid triggering the collapse that could kill them both. Jake's radio crackled with increasingly urgent communications from his command structure. His failure to report for hours had triggered search. Protocols and human forces were converging on his last known position. Similarly, Valkyrie military units were moving to investigate the crash site and protect their queen. "Control, this is Morrison," Jake finally responded to the radio calls. His voice strained from exertion. "I'm involved in civilian rescue operations. Request permission to complete current mission before reporting." The response was immediate and harsh. "Negative, Morrison. Return to designated coordinates immediately. We have enemy movement in your sector and need all personnel accounted for." Jake ignored the orders and continued his slow progress through the tunnel. Military protocols meant nothing compared to the life of the child in his arms. Kelvin had grown quiet during the journey, his small body limp with exhaustion and shock, but his breathing remained steady against Jake's armor. Light began filtering into the tunnel as they approached the opening. Jake could hear voices outside, Valkyrie civilians calling encouragement and updates on the structural stability. But he also detected new sounds that made his blood run cold. Heavy footsteps and mechanical voices that belonged to human combat units. His squad had found him. Jake emerged from the tunnel carefully, Prince Kelvin still cradled in his arms. The scene that greeted him was tense beyond description. Human soldiers had surrounded the rescue site, their weapons raised and ready for combat. Valkyrie guards faced them with equal hostility, creating a standoff that could explode into violence at any moment. Queen Zarathil stood between the two forces, her golden armor dusty but her bearing proud and defiant. Her eyes met Jake's as he climbed from the debris, and he saw gratitude mixed with desperate worry for what would happen next. "Sergeant Morrison," called Lieutenant Dave Collins, Jake's commanding officer, "step away from the enemy personnel and report your status." Immediately. Jake looked down at the injured child in his arms, then at the alien queen who had worked beside him to save her son's life. The moment felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, with one choice leading to safety and duty, while the other pointed toward an unknown future built on compassion and understanding. "The child needs medical attention," Jake said finally, making his decision. "He has possible fractures and trauma injuries that require immediate treatment." Collins stared at him in disbelief. "Are you seriously prioritizing enemy casualties over following direct orders?" Before Jake could respond, Zarathil stepped forward with regal authority that commanded attention even from hostile forces. "This human soldier risked his life to save my son," she announced clearly, her voice carrying across the tense standoff. "By the ancient laws of my people, he is under royal protection." The proclamation stunned both sides into momentary silence. Commander Veltar looked at his queen with shock while the human soldiers exchanged confused glances. The idea of an alien leader publicly defending a human was unprecedented in their experience of this war. Jake felt the weight of history pressing down on the moment. Two military forces faced each other across a pile of rubble while he stood in the middle holding an alien child. Every person present understood they were witnessing something significant, though none could predict what consequences might follow. Prince Kelvin stirred in Jake's arms, his golden eyes opening to look around at the armed soldiers surrounding them. The young Valkyrie should have been terrified, but instead he reached up to touch Jake's helmet with curious fingers. To him, this human was not a monster, but the gentle voice that had comforted him in darkness and carried him to safety. The simple gesture of trust from an innocent child somehow diffused the immediate tension. Weapons remained raised on both sides, but the finger trigger alertness eased slightly as everyone processed the implications of what they were witnessing. Jake knew his military career was probably over regardless of what happened next. He had disobeyed direct orders, fraternized with enemy leadership, and prioritized alien life over human strategic objectives. Court-martial proceedings seemed inevitable, but looking down at the child in his arms, he found he could live with those consequences. The standoff stretched across several heartbeats while both military forces processed the unprecedented situation. Jake stood in the center holding Prince Kelvin, acutely aware that dozens of weapons from both sides could end his life in an instant. Yet the child's trust gave him strength to face whatever consequences awaited. Lieutenant Collins stepped forward, his face a mask of military discipline struggling with human confusion. Morrison, I'm ordering you to release the alien and report for immediate debriefing. Your actions here constitute a serious breach of protocol. Jake met his commanding officer's gaze steadily. Sir, this child requires urgent medical attention. I request permission to ensure he receives appropriate care before addressing other matters. The lieutenant's expression hardened at what he perceived as continued insubordination. Behind him, other human soldiers shifted nervously, unsure how to handle a situation their training had never covered. They had been prepared for enemy resistance, not for their own sergeant protecting alien royalty. Queen Zarathil watched the exchange with growing understanding of the price Jake would pay for his compassion. She had initially assumed humans felt no loyalty to each other, but clearly this soldier was sacrificing his own standing to protect her son. The realization struck at the foundation of everything she had believed about the enemy. Commander Veltar, she said quietly to her own military leader, arrange for immediate medical evacuation of my son. This human will accompany us to ensure Prince Kelwin receives the best possible care. Her guards stared in shock at the order. Bringing an enemy soldier aboard their medical transport violated every security protocol in their extensive training. Yet none dared question their queen's direct command, especially given the extraordinary circumstances. Collins raised his weapon with renewed authority. I cannot allow enemy forces to capture one of our personnel, regardless of the circumstances. Morrison, you will comply with orders or face charges of treason and collaboration with hostile forces. Jake felt the moment crystallizing around him. Like the alien crystals that formed this beautiful, war-torn city, two choices lay before him: return to the familiar world of military obedience where enemies remained clearly defined, or step into unknown territory where compassion transcended species boundaries. The child needs help, he said simply, adjusting his grip on Prince Kelwin. That's more important than regulations or politics or anything else happening here. Before Collins could respond, the sound of approaching aircraft filled the air above them. Valkyrie medical transports descended toward the crash site, their sleek hulls gleaming despite the smoke and destruction surrounding them. The rescue. Ships represented salvation for the injured prince, but also an escape route that would take Jake far from everything he had ever known. Prince Kelwin stirred again in Jake's arms, his small hand gripping the human soldier's armor with surprising strength. The child looked up at him with golden eyes full of innocent trust, then spoke his first words since the rescue in halting human language learned from intelligence broadcasts. Thank you, Kelwin whispered, the simple phrase carrying profound meaning in the tense silence. The words hit both military forces like a physical blow. Human soldiers stared at an alien child expressing gratitude to one of their own, while Valkyrie guards witnessed their young prince showing affection for a supposed monster. The moment revealed the artificial nature of the hatred that had fueled their war for so many years. Jake felt tears threatening behind his helmet visor as he looked down at the brave little prince. This child represented everything pure and innocent in a universe darkened by violence and misunderstanding. Protecting him felt more meaningful than any military objective Jake had ever pursued. You're welcome, little guy, he replied softly. Everything's going to be okay now. Queen Zarathil approached them as her medical team prepared to load Prince Kelwin aboard the transport. Her golden eyes met Jake's through his helmet visor, and for a moment all the barriers between species and enemies seemed to dissolve. Two parents looked at each other with shared understanding of what truly mattered in life. I was wrong about your people, she said quietly, her voice carrying only far enough for Jake to hear. Perhaps we have all been wrong about many things. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of revelation settling on his shoulders. Maybe it's not too late to find a better way forward. The medical team carefully transferred Prince Kelwin from Jake's arms to a specialized stretcher designed for Valkyrie physiology. The child reached back toward the human soldier as they carried him toward the transport, his small voice calling out in his own language. Zarathil translated with a sad smile. He's asking if you'll come visit him when he feels better." Before Jake could respond, Lieutenant Collins stepped between them with weapon raised. "This ends now, Morrison. You will not board that enemy aircraft under any circumstances." Jake looked at his commanding officer, then at the alien queen who had shown him that enemies could become allies through simple acts of kindness. The war would continue regardless of his choice. But perhaps some small seeds of peace had been planted in the rubble of this destroyed city. "I understand your position, Lieutenant," Jake said formally. "I'll submit to whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate after ensuring the child reaches proper medical care." The compromise satisfied no one completely but offered a path forward that avoided immediate bloodshed. Jake watched as Prince Kelwin was loaded aboard the medical transport, the child's golden eyes never leaving him until the aircraft doors closed. Queen Zarathil paused at the boarding ramp, looking back at Jake one final time. "The universe is smaller than we believed," she said cryptically. "Perhaps our paths will cross again under better circumstances." The Volcari transports lifted off in formation, carrying the royal family away from the battlefield while Jake remained behind to face the consequences of his choices. His fellow soldiers surrounded him with mixtures of admiration and confusion, unsure whether he was a hero or a traitor. As the alien ships disappeared into the orange sky, Jake noticed something lying in the rubble where he had first heard Kelwin's cries for help. His discarded helmet lay among the crystal fragments, abandoned when he had crawled into the tunnel to save a child who was supposed to be his enemy. The war continued around them, but something fundamental had changed in that moment of shared humanity. Jake had chosen compassion over orders, while Queen Zarathil had chosen truth over propaganda. Neither knew what consequences would follow, but both understood they could never return to the simple certainties they had once embraced. In the days that followed, stories of the incident spread through both military forces. Some dismissed it as battlefield confusion or enemy propaganda, but others began questioning the narratives they had been taught about their opponents. Prince Kelwin recovered fully from his injuries, often asking his mother to tell him again about the human who saved him from the darkness. The seeds of change had been planted in the rubble of war, small acts of courage and compassion that would grow in ways none of them could predict. The universe remained vast and full of conflict, but it had also proven capable of unexpected kindness between the most unlikely allies.